Susan Carter's home sat at the end of a tree-lined cul-de-sac, surrounded by neatly trimmed lawns and white picket fences. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew each other. And while the friendships were polite, they rarely ventured beyond the occasional wave or borrowed cup of sugar. Susan, 67 and widowed for nearly a decade, had built a life of solitude since her husband, Paul, passed away. Her days were marked by routines, tending her small vegetable garden, reading novels on the porch, and baking pies for the church bake sale. It was a simple life, but it was one she found comfort in. However, her quiet existence had taken on a new dimension over the past few years. Helen Morris, her elderly neighbor, had become more than just the woman who lived next door. Helen, 88, was frail and alone, her health deteriorating steadily after the death of her husband, Frank, nearly 20 years earlier. Their connection had begun with small gestures. Susan, noticing Helen struggling to carry groceries one afternoon, had offered to help. That simple act of kindness blossomed into a bond that became a lifeline for them both. Susan's mornings often began with a short walk across her neatly paved driveway to Helen's home. She'd carry a tray of breakfast, usually scrambled eggs, toast, and a cup of tea, and let herself in with the spare key Helen had insisted she take. "Good morning, Helen," Susan greeted her cheerfully one bright Tuesday morning, placing the tray on the small table near the recliner where Helen spent most of her days. Helen looked up, her pale blue eyes lighting with gratitude. "Good morning, dear. You're too kind to keep doing this for me." "Nonsense," Susan replied, fluffing the pillows behind Helen's back. "You'd do the same for me if the roles were reversed." Helen chuckled softly. "Maybe when I was younger. These days, I'm more of a burden than a helper." Susan stopped adjusting the pillows and knelt by Helen's side, taking her hand. "You are not a burden, Helen. Don't ever think that." Their conversations often meandered into stories about the past. Helen would recount tales of her younger years, her marriage to Frank, and the travels they'd shared before his death. Susan, in turn, shared memories of her life with Paul, their vacations, and the children they had raised together. Though Susan had children of her own, they lived out of state, and their visits were infrequent. Helen's stories filled a void, offering Susan the warmth of a connection she often missed in her day-to-day life. Over time, Susan's role in Helen's life grew beyond simple companionship. She accompanied Helen to doctor's appointments, picked up her prescriptions, and even managed her household chores. It wasn't out of obligation. It was born from genuine affection and the shared understanding that both women had lost so much. One rainy afternoon, Susan sat by Helen's side, organizing a box of old photographs. Helen's delicate fingers traced the edges of a black and white photo of her and Frank on their wedding day. The bride in the picture beamed, her lace veil catching the sunlight. "You were stunning," Susan said, admiring the photo, "and Frank looks so dashing." Helen smiled faintly, her gaze distant. "Those were good days," she murmured. "But life has a way of changing, doesn't it? You think you have it all figured out? And then, well, things happen." The melancholy in Helen's voice didn't go unnoticed, but Susan didn't press. She assumed Helen was referring to the loss of her husband and chose instead to change the subject. Later that same afternoon, as Susan gathered the scattered photographs, her hand brushed against the edge of an envelope wedged beneath the armchair cushion. She pulled it out, glancing at the elegant handwriting on the front. It was addressed to Helen, but bore no return address. Susan hesitated. "Helen, this must have fallen from one of your boxes," she said, holding up the envelope. Helen froze, her expression shifting from warmth to unease. Her thin hands trembled as she reached for the letter. "Oh, yes," she said softly, taking it from Susan and clutching it to her chest. "Just an old letter, nothing important." Nothing. Susan's curiosity was piqued. Helen's reaction was uncharacteristically guarded, a stark contrast to her usual openness. But before Susan could ask further, Helen slipped the envelope into the drawer of a nearby side table. "Would you mind fetching me a glass of water, dear?" Helen asked, her tone dismissive. "Of course," Susan replied, masking her confusion. As she filled the glass in the kitchen, she couldn't help but wonder what could have been in the letter to make Helen so uneasy. Was it a private memory? A piece of her past she wasn't ready to share? A lingering doubt. That evening, as Susan returned to her own home, the image of Helen clutching the letter replayed in her mind. She knew she shouldn't pry. Helen's life and memories were her own. But the tension in Helen's response had planted a seed of doubt. Sitting in her favorite armchair, Susan sipped her tea and stared out the window at the soft glow of Helen's living room light. They had shared so much over the years. Yet this small mystery gnawed at Susan. What was in that letter, and why had it unsettled Helen so deeply? She tried to shake off her curiosity. But as the days passed, the memory of Helen's guarded reaction lingered. Susan reminded herself that even the closest of friends had secrets. But she couldn't escape the feeling that this was something more. Something that might explain the quiet sorrow Helen carried with her every day. A few days later, Susan was at Helen's home, tidying up the living room while Helen napped in her recliner. The house was filled with its usual sense of quiet stillness. The hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of an old wall clock the only sounds. As Susan rearranged a pile of magazines on the side table, she noticed the drawer was slightly ajar. Inside, the envelope she had seen earlier sat at the top of a neatly stacked collection of papers. Susan's heart quickened as her eyes lingered on it. "It's none of your business," she reminded herself. But the memory of Helen's unease and the cryptic way she had brushed off the letter gnawed at her. Susan hesitated, glancing toward Helen to make sure she was still asleep. Then, with trembling hands, she opened the drawer, pulled out the envelope, and carefully unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was familiar but formal, written with precision and care. As Susan read the opening lines, her breath caught. "My dearest Helen, I've carried this guilt for too long, and I can no longer keep it inside. You deserve the truth about what happened, even if it means you'll never forgive me." The letter was signed by Frank, Helen's late husband. What followed was a confession of an affair he had had decades ago, a betrayal that had haunted him until his death. But it wasn't the admission of infidelity that shook Susan to her core. The name of the other woman was Margaret. Susan froze, the letter trembling in her hands. Margaret was her mother. Susan reread the letter, hoping she had misunderstood, but the words were clear. Frank described a brief but intense affair with Margaret, detailing how their paths had crossed during a charity event. He expressed remorse, stating he had ended it when he realized how much he loved Helen. But the affair had left scars he could never fully heal. Susan's mind raced. Her mother, Margaret, had always been the picture of grace and loyalty. Growing up, Susan had idolized her, a devoted wife and mother who had balanced family life with an unshakable sense of integrity. To learn that her mother had been part of an affair shattered everything she thought she knew. Her first instinct was anger. How could her mother have done this? How could Helen have lived with this knowledge for so long? But beneath the anger was a deep sadness. Susan had spent years caring for Helen, building a bond that felt like family. Now, that bond seemed built on a lie. Susan carefully refolded the letter and placed it back in the envelope, tucking it into the drawer exactly as she had found it. She glanced at Helen, still asleep in her recliner, her frail figure rising and falling with each soft breath. For a moment, Susan considered waking her, demanding answers. But what would that accomplish? Helen had chosen to keep this secret for decades. She must have had her reasons. Instead, Susan left quietly, her thoughts swirling. She needed time to process what she had learned. Back home, Susan sat in her armchair, staring blankly at the pages of an open book she couldn't bring herself to read. The revelation had upended her sense of identity. Her mother's actions felt like a betrayal of her father, her family, and even Susan herself. Yet, at the same time, Susan couldn't ignore the pain Helen must have endured in silence. Why didn't she tell me? Susan wondered. Did she think I couldn't handle it? Or did she keep it a secret to protect me? The more she thought about it, the more questions surfaced. Did her father know about the affair? Had it affected their marriage in ways she hadn't noticed as a child? And what had prompted Frank to confess in writing, but never tell Helen face to face? Susan's emotions oscillated between anger, guilt, and confusion. She felt betrayed by both her mother and Helen. Yet she also couldn't ignore the deep bond she shared with Helen. Their friendship had become a cornerstone of Susan's life. Was it worth throwing that away over sins of the past? After a sleepless night, Susan made a decision. She couldn't move forward without addressing what she had learned. Avoiding the truth would only deepen the divide growing in her heart. The next morning, she returned to Helen's house. As she entered the living room, Helen looked up from her knitting, her face lighting with a smile. "Good morning, Susan. You're here early." Susan sat down across from her, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Helen," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I need to talk to you about something, and I need you to be honest with me." Helen's smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. "What is it, dear?" Susan hesitated, then plunged ahead. "While I was tidying up the other day, I found a letter from Frank." Helen's expression shifted immediately. Her hands stilled on her knitting needles, and her eyes darted away. "I see," she said softly. "I read it," Susan admitted. "I know I shouldn't have, but I couldn't help myself. Helen, Margaret was my mother." Helen closed her eyes, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the years had finally caught up with her. "I was hoping you wouldn't find it," she said quietly. "I didn't want you to know." "Why not?" Susan asked, her voice sharp. "You've known for years, like you've been living with this secret while I've been here, helping you, caring for you. Did you think I wouldn't find out eventually?" Helen opened her eyes, tears glistening. "I didn't tell you because it wouldn't have changed anything. What good would it have done to bring up old wounds? Your mother was a good woman. Susan, she made a mistake, but she loved your father, and she loved you. I didn't want you to remember her differently." Susan's anger faltered as she listened to Helen's words. She had expected defensiveness or blame, but instead, she saw only sadness and regret. Helen's pain was evident, but so was her compassion. "I don't know how to feel about this," Susan admitted, her voice breaking. "I feel like I've lost something, like I don't even know who my mother was anymore." Helen reached for Susan's hand, her grip surprisingly firm. "You haven't lost her, Susan. She was the same woman who raised you, who loved you, who built a life with your father. Nothing about this changes that." Susan nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. She wasn't sure if she could fully believe Helen's words, but a part of her wanted to. The days that followed Susan's conversation with Helen were filled with emotional turbulence. She couldn't stop replaying their talk in her mind, nor could she forget the contents of Frank's letter. Each word seemed to echo, unraveling the foundation of what Susan thought she knew about her family and her bond with Helen. Susan spent hours in her late mother's belongings, digging through old photo albums and journals, searching for clues. She had always seen her mother as a paragon of virtue, a woman who could do no wrong. Now, every memory felt like it had been tainted by this revelation. One afternoon, Susan found an old journal tucked away in a box of keepsakes. As she flipped through the pages, her heart raced. There, in her mother's handwriting, were entries from the time of the affair. Margaret hadn't written about Frank explicitly, but the guilt and conflict were palpable in her words. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but I can't let it define me. Paul and Susan are my world, and I have to do better for them. Susan closed the journal, tears streaming down her face. Her mother's remorse was evident, but it didn't erase the pain of discovering the betrayal. It didn't make it easier to reconcile the image of her mother as a loving wife and mother with the woman who had participated in an affair. Determined to find clarity, Susan returned to Helen's house. This time, she wasn't just seeking answers. She was seeking closure. Helen was sitting in her recliner, a book resting on her lap. She looked up as Susan entered, her expression a mix of warmth and apprehension. "Susan," she said softly, "I was hoping you'd come by." Susan sat across from her, clutching the journal she had found. "I've been reading my mother's journals," she began. She felt terrible about what happened. "Helen?" She knew it was wrong. Helen nodded, her gaze steady. "I never doubted that. Susan, your mother wasn't a bad person. She made a mistake, just like Frank did. But she loved you and your father deeply." Susan's voice trembled as she continued. "I don't understand. Helen, how did you forgive him? How did you live with this knowledge all these years?" Helen sighed, her hands trembling slightly as she set the book aside. "Forgiveness isn't something that happens all at once," she said. "It's a choice you make every day. Frank came to me, broken and full of regret. He promised to be better, and he was. He spent the rest of his life making it up to me in ways big and small, and I chose to stay, Susan, because I still loved him, despite the pain he caused." Helen's voice grew softer, tinged with sadness. "But forgiveness isn't just about the other person, it's about yourself. Holding on to anger and resentment only eats away at you. I forgave Frank for my own sake, so I could find peace. And I forgave your mother too. I realized she was human, just like the rest of us." Susan listened, her emotions a swirl of anger, sadness, and understanding. Helen's words resonated, but they didn't erase the hurt she felt. "I don't know if I can forgive as easily as you did," she admitted. "It feels too big, too overwhelming." Helen reached for Susan's hand. "That's okay. Susan, forgiveness isn't easy, and it doesn't happen overnight. Take your time, but don't let it consume you. Don't let it rob you of the good memories you have of your mother, or of us." Later that evening, Susan sat alone in her living room, staring at the quilt she had been working on for Helen. Each stitch had been a labor of love, a symbol of their bond. But now, it felt incomplete, as if the threads themselves carried the weight of the past. She thought about Helen's words, about forgiveness and the choices we make. She thought about her mother's journals and the remorse Margaret had carried. And she thought about the relationship she and Helen had built, one that had been real and meaningful, despite the secrets. For the first time, Susan allowed herself to feel compassion, not just for Helen and her mother, but for herself. She didn't have to have all the answers now. She didn't have to forgive immediately. But she could take the first step. The next morning, Susan returned to Helen's house, carrying the finished quilt. Helen greeted her with a warm smile, her frailty more pronounced than ever. "Good morning, dear," she said. "What's this?" Susan unfolded the quilt, spreading it across Helen's lap. The patchwork design featured fabrics from Susan's own collection and pieces Helen had given her over the years. Each square represented a memory, a shared moment. "It's for you," Susan said, her voice steady. "I've been working on it for months. I didn't know if I'd finish it, but here it is." Helen ran her hands over the quilt, her eyes welling with tears. It's beautiful. Susan, thank you. Susan sat beside her, a sense of peace washing over her. For the first time since discovering the letter, she felt a glimmer of hope, that their bond could survive this revelation, that the past didn't have to define their future. A few weeks later, Susan received a phone call from Helen's doctor. Helen's health had taken a sudden decline, and she had been admitted to the hospital. The news hit Susan like a wave. Despite their recent challenges, she had come to love Helen like family. The thought of losing her filled Susan with urgency. She rushed to the hospital, her heart pounding. When she entered Helen's room, the frail woman looked smaller than ever, her skin pale and her breathing labored. Yet when she saw Susan, her face lit up with a faint smile. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Helen said weakly. Susan sat by her bedside, taking her hand. "Of course I came. Don't be silly." Helen chuckled softly, though the effort seemed to tire her. "I know things have been complicated between us lately. I worried I'd pushed you away." Susan's throat tightened. "You didn't push me away?" "Helen? I just needed time to process everything." Helen nodded, her eyes glistening. "I understand. But if something happens to me, I don't want you to carry this burden. The past. It doesn't matter anymore. What matters is the time we've shared. Susan, that's what's real." As the conversation continued, Helen revealed more about her feelings during the time of Frank's betrayal. "When I first found out about the affair," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I wanted to leave him. I wanted to scream, to hate him, to make him feel the pain I felt. But then I realized something. I would be punishing myself too. I would be throwing away everything we had built together over one mistake." Susan listened intently, her own heart heavy with emotion. Helen's capacity for forgiveness seemed almost superhuman to her. She couldn't imagine how anyone could endure such pain and still choose to stay. "It wasn't easy," Helen continued. "There were days I questioned everything. But Frank worked hard to rebuild my trust. And over time, I realized that forgiving him didn't mean forgetting what he'd done. It meant choosing to focus on the love we still had instead of the pain." Susan thought about her own struggles with forgiveness, not just for her mother's actions, but for Helen's decision to keep the secret from her. Could she ever reach the place Helen had described? Could she let go of the resentment that had taken root in her heart? That night, after leaving the hospital, Susan sat alone in her living room, her thoughts a tangled mess. She looked at the quilt she had made for Helen, now draped over the back of her armchair. Each square represented a piece of their shared history, good and bad. Finally, she realized something profound. Forgiveness wasn't about excusing what had happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It was about choosing to move forward despite the pain. Helen had been right. Holding on to anger only robbed her of the good memories, the moments of genuine connection she and Helen had shared. With this realization, Susan felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She wasn't ready to forgive completely, not yet, but she could start. The next day, Susan returned to the hospital, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. Helen looked surprised to see her so soon. "You're back," Helen said, her voice raspier than before. "I'm not going anywhere," Susan replied, pulling a chair closer to the bed. "There's something I want to say." Helen's eyes searched Susan's face, a mix of hope and trepidation. "What is it, dear?" Susan took a deep breath. "I don't know if I can forgive everything right now, but I want you to know that I love you. Helen, you've been like a second mother to me, and I don't want the past to ruin what we have." Tears welled in Helen's eyes, spilling down her cheeks. "Oh, Susan," she whispered. "You have no idea what that means to me." They sat together in silence for a while, their bond stronger than ever, despite the challenges they had faced. For Susan, it was the beginning of healing, a tentative step toward forgiveness that felt both terrifying and freeing. Later that week, Susan received a surprise visitor at her home, a distant cousin she hadn't seen in years. During their conversation, the cousin casually mentioned something that reignited Susan's lingering doubts. "You know, your mother was always the life of the party," the cousin said. "I remember hearing whispers about her and some man at one of those charity events. People loved her, but they couldn't help talking." Susan froze. "Whispers? About what?" she asked cautiously. "Oh, nothing concrete," the cousin replied. "Just rumors. You know how people are." The comment sent Susan spiraling. She had worked so hard to let go of the pain and focus on her mother's love and devotion. Now, the old doubts threatened to resurface. That evening, Susan visited Helen again, seeking comfort. She shared what the cousin had said, her voice trembling with frustration and sadness. "It's like I can't escape this. Helen, every time I think I'm ready to move on, something pulls me back." Helen listened patiently, her frailty making her seem even more serene. When Susan finished, Helen reached for her hand. "Susan," she said softly, "your mother's mistake doesn't define her or you. You are more than the whispers of the past. You are your own person, and you have the power to choose what you hold on to." Helen paused, her breathing labored. "I've lived a long life, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Forgiveness is not for the other person. It's for yourself. Let go, Susan. Not for me, not for your mother, but for you." Susan left the hospital that night feeling lighter than she had in weeks. Helen's words echoed in her mind, a reminder that she didn't have to carry the burden of the past any longer. She decided to focus on the love and memories that had shaped her life, not the mistakes that had threatened to overshadow them. Helen's health continued to decline in the weeks that followed. Susan remained by her side, tending to her needs and holding her hand during the quiet moments. Their conversations became more introspective, filled with shared memories, laughter, and unspoken understanding. One morning, as the sunlight streamed through the hospital window, Helen looked at Susan with a gentle smile. "Susan," she began, her voice weaker than ever, "I want you to know something. You've given me more than I could have ever asked for. You made these last years of my life full of joy, even when I didn't think it was possible." Susan's throat tightened. "You've given me just as much. Helen, you've been like a second mother to me." Helen squeezed Susan's hand, her eyes brimming with tears. "Then promise me something. Promise me you'll live your life fully. Don't let the past hold you back. You deserve to be happy. Susan." Susan nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I promise. Helen." Later that evening, surrounded by the quiet hum of the hospital machines, Helen passed away peacefully, her hand still resting in Susan's. In the days following Helen's passing, Susan felt a profound emptiness. Her home, once filled with the rhythm of her daily visits to Helen, felt unnaturally quiet. Yet, amidst the grief, there was also a sense of peace. Helen's words during her final days lingered in Susan's mind, guiding her toward a new perspective on life. As Susan sorted through Helen's belongings, she found a small box labeled "For Susan." Inside was the quilt Susan had made for Helen, carefully folded alongside a handwritten note. "Dear Susan, you've been my light in these later years, my reminder that love and kindness can heal even the deepest wounds. This quilt represents our journey together, the good, the painful, and everything in between. I hope it reminds you of the bond we shared, one that no mistake or secret could ever break. With all my love, Helen." Susan clutched the note to her chest, tears streaming down her face. Helen's words were a final gift, one that solidified their bond and gave Susan the closure she needed. Inspired by Helen's note, Susan decided to visit her mother's grave for the first time in years. She brought with her the journal she had found, along with a bouquet of Margaret's favorite flowers, yellow tulips. Standing at the grave site, Susan spoke aloud, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. "Mom, I've been angry with you, hurt by what I learned, but I've also come to understand that you were human, just like the rest of us. You made a mistake, but that doesn't erase the love you gave or the life you built with Dad and me." She placed the flowers at the base of the headstone, her heart lighter than it had been in months. "I forgive you, Mom, not because it's easy, but because it's time. Time to let go of the pain and hold on to the love." As she walked away, Susan felt a renewed sense of purpose. She couldn't change the past, but she could choose how it shaped her future. In the months that followed, Susan poured herself into her quilting, creating pieces that told stories of love, resilience, and forgiveness. She joined a local quilting group, where she found a new circle of friends who shared her passion and offered a sense of community she hadn't realized she was missing. One day, the group encouraged her to showcase her work at a local art fair. Susan hesitated at first, unsure if her pieces were worthy of public display. But as she looked at the quilts she had made, each one a testament to her journey, she realized they were more than just fabric and thread. They were symbols of her growth, her strength, and her ability to find beauty even in the hardest moments. At the fair, Susan's booth drew a steady stream of visitors. Many were drawn to the quilt she had made for Helen, now displayed prominently with a small card that read, "In memory of Helen Morris, a friend, a mentor, a second mother." One evening, after the fair had ended, Susan sat on her porch with a cup of tea, reflecting on the path that had brought her here. She thought about Helen, her mother, and the lessons they had both taught her, lessons about love, forgiveness, and the complexity of human relationships. Her phone buzzed, and she saw a message from her daughter, inviting her to spend the holidays with the family. For years, Susan had been hesitant to impose, afraid of being a burden. But now, she realized how much she valued the connections in her life. She replied with a simple message, "I'd love to come." Susan's journey wasn't about erasing the past, but about embracing its lessons. She had learned that forgiveness wasn't a single act, but a process, one that required courage, vulnerability, and a willingness to let go of pain. Through her bond with Helen, Susan discovered the strength to confront her own wounds and build a future rooted in love and connection. Her story is a reminder that even in the face of betrayal and loss, it's possible to find healing and hope. It's a testament to the power of human relationships, the resilience of the heart, and the beauty of starting anew.